All right, so thank you all for coming today. My name is David Zurich. I'm chair of the history department here at the University of Scranton. And the talk I'm going to give today, I titled "This Company of Loyola and Nativism in the 19th Century United States." And the title is taken from a letter that we're going to open with here in a couple of minutes. But I also want to talk a little bit about doing this as part of the Slattery Center for the Humanities lecture. Part of what I'm doing with the humanities and thinking about this in that sense is I want to tell you a couple of stories and really to give you a context for this. It's a couple of stories I think that inform American identity, American sense of self, and American values. And so with that, I'm going to start with, there's a much smaller story that I'm going to frame the larger story of the tarring and feathering of John Babs. And this is the smaller story. John Adams famously wrote to Thomas Jefferson, at least within Jesuit circles famously, in May of 1816. And he said, "I do not like the late resurrection of the Jesuits. The Jesuits in the United States are more numerous than everybody knows. Shall we not have swarms of them here in the shape of printers, editors, writers, schoolmasters, etc.? If any congregation of men could merit eternal perdition on earth and in hell, it is this company of Loyola. If they do not put the purity of our elections to a severe trial, it will be a wonder." And I tell that story a little bit because it's funny to sort of think of John Adams singling out the Jesuits as a threat to American identity, to the American experiment. And this letter is often highlighted just in that way to sort of talk about how Adams felt about the Jesuits. There's another piece to this as well, because what you see with Adams in 1816 is a strain of anti-Catholicism that remains prominent in American life throughout the 19th century. And no more so than in the 1840s and 1850s with the rise of this group called the Know-Nothings. Between about 1845 and 1855, there was a massive wave of immigrants coming into the United States from Europe. They're coming because of industrialization. They're coming because of population growth. They're coming because of crop failure, right? This is the famous potato famine. There were opportunities in the United States for these immigrants, primarily coming from Ireland and Germany. And they tended to settle in northern cities. With this wave of immigrants coming into the United States, there was a real fear that these unskilled immigrants, who were all, for the most part, many of them Catholic, would be under the control of the Pope, that they could not be good citizens of the United States, and that sort of papal authority and loyalty to Rome was incompatible with democracy and American government. They argued that these immigrants took American jobs, but they drank too much. They refused to learn the language in the case of the Germans, and they refused to assimilate. That they increased poverty, crime, and disease. And you see it here in this political cartoon, right? You've got the Irishman made out of a barrel of whiskey. You've got the German made out of a keg of beer, and they're walking off with the ballot box, leaving rioting in the streets behind them. So you have this real sort of anti-immigrant nativist impulse that manifests itself as a political party. The party's formal name is the American Party, although when you were asked about it, you were supposed to say you didn't know about it, so you know nothing. So ultimately, it is more commonly known as the Know-Nothing Party. The Know-Nothings condemned both Democrats and Whigs. They said both were too controlled by elites, and they saw themselves as something of a populist movement. They wanted to restrict office holding to native-born citizens. They wanted to prohibit the use of public funds for parochial schools. They wanted to raise the period you had to wait before naturalization from 5 years to 21 years. And so nationally, what you saw with the rise of the Know-Nothings was a sort of moment where there was a breakdown of the second party system, right? The Whigs and the Democrats. And there's a growing sort of dissatisfaction with them. And the Know-Nothings then sort of fuse an anti-Catholic impulse with a nativist impulse, with a reform impulse as well. All right, so they're drawing disaffected Democrats and Whigs into the party. So saying what we need to do is sort of clean up America, limit this immigration, limit these threats. And it made for a very confused time. But the Know-Nothings were opportunistic. They espoused opposition to the status quo with little concern for coherence and consistency. So sometimes they go this way, other times they go that. But it was enough to sort of oppose the status quo that they had tremendous political success. They won control of state legislatures in Pennsylvania, in Delaware, Massachusetts, Maryland, Kentucky, and elected 75 members of their party to Congress. And I lay out the sort of political tumult and the politics because it's in that environment that we meet Father John Baptist. Baptist was born in Switzerland in 1815, enters a Jesuit order in 1835, and then is ordained in December of 1846. Following the Swiss Civil War between the Catholic and Protestant cantons, Baptist fled Switzerland for France. In the spring of 1848, shortly after arriving in France, Father Baptist and many of his exiled Swiss colleagues received orders to travel to the American missions. Baptist made his way to New York before arriving at his assigned post in Old Town, Maine, to minister to the Penobscot Indians. Faced with a variety of challenges, including a complete lack of training in either English or Abenaki, the Penobscot language, Baptist adapted quickly. He was brilliant with languages. And with the help of a French-speaking Penobscot woman, Baptist developed a basic knowledge of Abenaki, and within months of his arrival, learned enough of the language to minister to the Penobscot people. With his new skills, he was soon hearing confessions, working to establish a temperance society, and acting to facilitate a settlement between rival factions of the tribe. After 3 years in Old Town, Baptist relocated to Eastport, Maine. And this is just to give you a sense of the scale. So he's at the extreme eastern end of, well, really of the United States, but certainly Maine. You see it there in the sort of far right piece of Maine. And he went to Eastport to work with the established French-Canadian missions, but also with the growing Irish immigrant population. His territory spanned hundreds of miles from Eastport to Waterville, which you can see is straight north of Augusta. It encompassed the parishes of 8 churches and 33 chapels, some 9,000 Catholics. It also included the Passamaquoddy people at Pleasant Point near Eastport. In 1852 alone, Baptist performed 110 baptisms and officiated at 20 marriages. Baptist travels were nearly constant, answering sick calls, making financial appeals to aid in the construction of churches, giving instruction to those seeking to convert to Catholicism, overseeing Sunday schools, and founding temperance societies throughout the state. Despite the challenges of his assignment, Baptist met with a great deal of success. As a result of his temperance effort, local Protestant officials in both Waterville and Skowhegan, citing the downturn in alcohol consumption in their communities, repeatedly asked the Jesuit to establish a permanent residence in their town. Baptist noted that the Protestant magistrate themselves reward me with great favor and are making every possible effort at my permanent residence in their midst. Baptist was convinced that with a better command of the English language, he could dispel the rest of their prejudices and awaken their slumbering consciences and to effect, perhaps, a veritable religious revolution. All of this was facilitated, Bapst wrote to a friend in Europe, by the bright side of American liberty. Bapst believed in the sort of promise and religious toleration that are often cited as a hallmark of American identity. And it's buoyed by these successes that Bapst eventually turns his attention to Ellsworth, which you can sort of see is straight north of Mount Desert Island there on the map. Because of the town's central location among nearly a dozen Catholic missions in the state, Bapst wrote to his provincial in September of 1852, calling for a good preacher who speaks good English and who is above all a virtuous man to be stationed at Ellsworth. In the end, it was Bapst himself who took up residence in Ellsworth in January of 1853. Bapst's reputation likely preceded him in Ellsworth, as one of the local newspapers, the Ellsworth Freeman, noted his arrival, declaring, "We are glad to give Mr. B a good welcome, as we doubt not his labors will result in much good of the flock of his charge and be of great moral benefit to the village." In the earliest days of Bapst's tenure in Ellsworth, there was no reason to expect that the success he had experienced in Waterville and Skowhegan and other places in Maine wouldn't be replicated in Ellsworth. The warm welcome for the Jesuit missionary, however, was to be short-lived, with tensions over the Bible and which version was to be used in the Ellsworth public schools that would draw the community into a contentious debate that would devolve into violence. The other sort of major player in our story is this guy, William H. Cheney. Cheney was, for his part, a native of Maine, born in 1821 in the town of Chesterville, which is just west of Waterville. And he endured a difficult childhood. Following the death of his father in 1830 in a sledding accident, Cheney bounced between homes of several different relatives and neighbors, and he developed a reputation as a combative and surly child. At the age of 16, he set out on his own, finding work on fishing schooners in Penobscot and Frenchman's Bays. After 2 years aboard fishing vessels, Cheney enlisted in the Navy. But in July of 1840, he deserted the receiving ship Columbus in Boston Harbor after only 9 months of service. Following his desertion, Cheney lit out for the American West. He initially intended to head to New Orleans, but he only made it as far as Ohio before he fell ill. Luckily for him, the people of Scotia Furnace, Ohio, came to Cheney's aid, nursing him back to health and helping him to obtain a teaching position in Porter Township in early 1841. Cheney had a moment of sort of self-reflection. And he then in this moment decided to sort of commit himself to self-improvement. And he eventually sort of was taken under the wing of a wealthy businessman named Ephraim Pollock, who recommended Cheney to a wealthy lawyer in what at the time was Wheeling, Virginia. Based on Pollock's recommendation, Morgan Nelson took Cheney in and helped train him in law to become a lawyer, right? It wasn't quite as formal as law school is today. You sort of would read the law and go into practice. On completing his studies and being admitted to the bar, Cheney moved to Burlington, Iowa in September of 1846. After a bit of a rocky start, he settled into his new home. He became the city recorder in July of 1850. And a year later, in July of 1851, Cheney was married to a local woman. For the briefest of moments, it seemed as though Cheney had sort of found a place for himself in the world. After a difficult childhood, after sort of bouncing around, he seemed like he had finally settled down. But sadly, it was not to last. Within only a matter of months, Cheney's life seemed to fall apart. At the end of September, his wife fell ill and died. And shortly thereafter, he lost his job. With his world crumbling, Cheney left Iowa and returned to Maine, responding to an advertisement by a man named Charles Lowe of Ellsworth, who was looking for a new law associate. The partnership of Lowell and Cheney began officially on May 1st of 1852, but was rocky from the start. Professionally, Cheney disdained legal precedent and the profession as a whole. He didn't go in for a lot of sort of the established practices. And his partnership with Lowell lasted only 5 months. Cheney continued to try to make a go of it in the law field, but his legal training had been unsystematic, and he never developed a sense of professional etiquette. Rather than working within the existing system, Cheney sought to find ways to reform the legal system to his vision. He declared the grand jury to be a humbug relic of medieval ignorance and argued that irresponsible prosecutors, jurors, and witnesses could destroy even an innocent man's reputation. Not surprisingly, Cheney's practice foundered, and he was forced to take up employment as a lumber store clerk, weighing out pork, drawing molasses, and trimming greasy lamps. Those were his description of the job. But eventually he landed on his feet. He found employment as the editor of the struggling Ellsworth Herald. Cheney laid out what he said was an independent course for the paper under his leadership, declaring the right to consider any issue, stating that he would not bow to any party or sect, political or religious. He also declared that the Herald would never consent to being used as a medium for personal abuse, crimination or recrimination, or a means whereby one party or sect may vent its spleen upon another, and thus stir our citizens up to strife and dissension. Despite his promise and vision, Cheney soon became a leading figure in the most contentious and violent political debate in Ellsworth's history. Prior to 1853, all of Ellsworth's public school students had made use of the Protestant King James Bible in their classwork. On the eve of the new school year in late summer of 1853, the Jesuit John Bapst, now in Ellsworth, actively encouraged Ellsworth's Catholic families to have their children refrain from using the Protestant Bible. In the face of these refusals, some of Ellsworth's teachers simply excused their Catholic students from participating in the reading exercises. Others, however, were more stringent and demanded their students participate in all class exercises. By October, the Ellsworth School Committee had weighed in on the nascent controversy, declaring that all students must use the King James Bible or leave the school. Bapst reacted bitterly to the news, writing to his provincial saying that the school committee had created this new rule out of bigotry. And in response to the committee's official policy, Bapst collected more than 100 signatures calling for an end to the Bible policy. But the school officials rejected the petition, declaring that all the students were to read the Protestant Bible or be dismissed from the schools. And should we find them loafing around the wharves, we will clap them in jail. School officials made good on that threat. On November 14th, they expelled 16 Catholic students who refused to participate in public Bible reading. In the face of the mass expulsion, Bapst organized a Catholic school in the old chapel and hired a teacher to oversee the students' education. The Ellsworth School Committee placed the blame for the entire incident on John Bapst. The committee members declared the Jesuit was responsible for the agitation on this subject and all of the evil that has resulted. Prior to the arrival of the Reverend Mr. Bapst, they argued that the city had been undisturbed in harmony on this subject. Worse still, they contended, he is a foreigner by birth, education, and allegiance. Under his dictation, a portion of our fellow citizens have deprived their children of the benefit of our schools, many of them stating to us that they themselves had no objection to the rule we had retained in reference to the Bible. Then in December of 1853, someone broke into a schoolhouse on the western side of town and destroyed 14 editions of the King James Bible. This act of vandalism was followed by name-calling and threats of violence by Catholics against members of the Ellsworth School Committee. In the face of this violence, Cheney declared that the Catholic Bible question was part of an elaborate Roman Catholic conspiracy to undermine the American Republic. Beginning in late January of 1854, Cheney organized a series of mass gatherings in Ellsworth to discuss the Catholic threat. At one of the first meetings, following a series of anti-Catholic speeches given by a number of prominent members of Ellsworth society, the group declared that it was their intent to, quote, destroy popery and everything appurtenant thereto. And they adopted the name the Cast Iron Band. Cheney's efforts did not end with the creation of the Cast Iron Band. In the weeks that followed the organization of the anti-Catholic nativist group, Cheney traveled throughout the neighboring villages of Hancock, Morgan's Bay, Blue Hill, Southwest Harbor, and Gouldsboro, speaking on behalf of the growing nativist impulse, gathering supporters throughout Hancock County. And it's this group, this band, that would ultimately fuse with the national Know Nothing movement as a backlash against Catholic and immigrant groups. Throughout the spring of 1854, Cheney's editorial efforts mirrored those of his public speaking engagements. Presenting issue after issue, Cheney railed against the Catholic threat, employing thinly veiled satire, political cartoons, and you can see one of them here in the slide, and outright attacks. Cheney decried the efforts of Father Baptist and what he called the Jack Catholics. And by April, Cheney went so far as to call for 1,000 men to come to Ellsworth and come quickly. For your services may yet be needed in more ways than one. Cheney's call for 1,000 men came as members of the Cast Iron Band marched through town taunting and threatening Catholics. Then in July of 1854, the selectmen of Ellsworth, Maine, a committee that was dominated primarily by Democrats, called for a town meeting to denounce the spate of anti-Catholic violence in the town. When the citizens gathered on July 8th at the Congregational Church, those responsible for much of the recent violence packed the meeting, dashing the peace-seeking hopes of the Ellsworth officials. The members of the Cast Iron Band proceeded to take control of the agenda and vote out the sitting Democratic majority, replacing them with members of their own number. Once in power, the newly elected selectmen passed a resolution threatening to tar and feather one John Baptist, S.J., Catholic priest, and then ride him out of town on a rail should he be caught in Ellsworth. Passage of the legislation was greeted by applause and signed by the town clerk, William H. Cheney, also editor of the Ellsworth Herald. Baptist wisely left Ellsworth for Bangor. But by that October, when Baptist was called to Cherryfield, 50 miles southeast of Bangor, with Ellsworth marking the halfway point of the journey, he decided to risk a visit to Ellsworth. He believed that the nativist furor in Ellsworth had run its course. And so in the evening of October 14th, 1854, rumors spread throughout Ellsworth that Baptist had returned. And the news elicited an immediate reaction. Local nativist leaders called for a special meeting of the Cast Iron Band, which assembled in Post Office Square. Shortly after 9 o'clock that evening, members of the band, donning masks, led a crowd through the driving rain to the home where Bapst was hearing confessions. Accounts vary as to what happened next. Some say that Bapst was dragged from the house by the mob. Others state that Bapst came out of his own volition to protect the residents of the home. Either way, the Cast Iron Band was determined to make good on their threat. The mob initially debated how best to proceed, but eventually they stripped Bapst of his clothes, robbing him of both his wallet and his watch, and proceeded to tar and feather him, all the while swearing at him. According to one newspaper, one of the mob jeered, "Why don't you call on your Virgin Mary for help?" They then placed their victim on a sharp rail and carried him for half a mile to the Tisdale shipyard and tossed him unconscious upon the wharf. At that point, despite some calls to hang the priest, the leader of the mob called an end to the attack. Bapst was rescued by a group of heavily armed Catholics who had been searching for him since the attack, and they carried him back to the home of supporters. The next morning, badly beaten, Bapst insisted that he be able to say Mass for his former parishioners before being taken to Bangor to recover. He would never return to Ellsworth. The attack on Bapst was in many ways the denouement of the vitriolic strain of know-nothingism that Cheney had fostered in Ellsworth. The public interplay between Bapst and Cheney, the rise of the Cast Iron Band, and the brutality of the tarring and feathering of the Jesuit generated a great deal of public attention and helped turn public opinion against this anti-Catholic impulse. Bapst himself believed that regret over the attack would be extremely useful to the cause of the Catholic Church in Maine. True to Bapst's expectations, the people of Bangor called a special meeting at which a gathering of Bangor's leading Protestants passed resolutions lauding the Jesuit for his, quote, admirable patience, his Christian forbearance, and his courageous zeal. The group also declared Bapst to be a blessing and an honored resident of Bangor. Following the reading of the resolutions, the chairman of this meeting, amid deafening applause by one report, presented Bapst with a well-filled purse and a gold watch to replace the timepiece that had been stolen from him during the attack. The engraving on the cover of the watch read, "To the Reverend John Bapst, S.J., from the citizens of Bangor, Maine, as a token of their high esteem." In many ways, the attack in Ellsworth only helped to strengthen the affinity for Bapst in eastern Maine. He would remain in Bangor for another 5 years, overseeing the construction of St. John's Church, which you see here in the image. This was the largest Catholic church in the state at the time. And then he was ultimately transferred to Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1859. During his final years in Maine, Bapst witnessed a political sea change. The political shift ranged from the partisan to the personal. As members of Ellsworth's newly formed Republican Party, many of them having been know-nothings at one point or another, sought to distance themselves from the anti-Catholic violence that had gripped Ellsworth. In attempting to assign blame, the Ellsworth Republicans found their target in a recently minted Democrat, William Cheney. The former editor of the Herald, which he had renamed the American, they argued, was responsible for all of the anti-Catholic tumult and violence. And by 1856, many of the former members of the Cast Iron Band were fleeing from the legacy of the once powerful group. While larger xenophobic populist and reform forces were in play throughout the United States, it was the role of individuals driving this latent impulse to new heights of violence. And these acts of violence alienated many would-be supporters. In the years after the attack, as I mentioned, Bapst was initially sent to Holy Cross, but then went on to become the first president of Boston College, overseeing the arrival of the first lay students in 1864. He then went on to become the superior of the New York and Canadian missions, and he wrote to the Jesuit Superior General in 1870, calling for the creation of a college in Jersey City, New Jersey. Conditions there, Bapst declared, will soon make it one of the most important cities in the Union. A college situated in the central part of the city and easily accessible could serve the growing immigrant population. And what's sort of amazing is that this became St. Peter's, which is to this day and still does serve many immigrants who come into the United States. And so Bapst's vision was prescient in many ways. Bapst continued to recognize, despite the many challenges in his own tarring and feathering, but he continued to recognize the opportunities presented to the Jesuits by the United States. And he recognized the level of engagement required to realize those opportunities. By 1879, Bapst's mental and physical health were failing. He left his post, ultimately residing at Mount Hope Retreat near Baltimore, where he died in 1887. Cheney, for his part, left Ellsworth after the attack, ultimately denouncing the town and the Know-Nothings. In 1859, he moved to Boston, finding spiritualism and becoming the editor of a newspaper called The Spiritualist Age. A few years later, he went to New York, where he befriended a British doctor who had come to the United States to popularize astrology. Cheney believed that astrology was, in his words, the most precious science ever known to man. He said that knowing a child's horoscope could help one develop all that is good in the child's character. From there, in 1870, Cheney moved to the Pacific Northwest, where he met a woman named Flora Wellman. When Flora became pregnant in 1875, various reports said that Cheney abandoned the woman when she refused to have an abortion. Cheney never met his newborn son. The boy's name was John Griffith Cheney, Jack. And Jack would eventually take the last name of his stepfather and grow up to be a man named Jack London, the famous author. Cheney's later life was spent in Chicago. In 1900, fellow astrologers praised him and observed how at the age of 80, he was still working every moment. He continued his anti-establishment sort of tirades. He continued to deride religion, particularly Christianity, and claimed that Adam and Eve no more existed than Santa Claus. Cheney died broke in Chicago in January of 1903. So having told you that story, I want to come back to those Adams and Jefferson letters. Because in some ways, where I started with Adams' denouncing of the Jesuits, we see that there is this strain, the Cheney strain of sort of anti-Catholic sentiment. And oftentimes when people read the Adams and Jefferson letters, that's what they focus on. Look at how much Adams hated the Jesuits. And it's there, it certainly is there, right? That's where I started. But what I want to point out is this near last line in Adams' letter. Because in some ways, this shows the other side. This shows the people of Bangor reacting to Cheney. Because the part of the letter from Adams that often gets ignored is that for everything that Adams just says about how dangerous the Jesuits are to the American way of life, to everything Adams and Jefferson spent their lives building. Adams comments that our system, however, of religious liberty must afford them asylum. And that's the real value of this letter. Because Adams said these guys are really scary. But because of who we say we are, because of what we say we believe, as scary as I think they are, we have to let them in. Because that's what we believe. That's who we are. And that's really what's amazing about that letter. That there's this fear, but there's this openness, this need to live up to our values. And so I think if you look at the Bapst-Cheney story in this context, you can see the impulse that motivates Cheney. But in the end, it is that promise, right? The people of Bangor are saying, no, this guy is a good man, and we will protect him. And in a lot of ways, Jefferson agrees with that line, because when Jefferson writes back in August of 1816, he said, I with you dislike the restoration of the Jesuits because it marks a retrograde step from light towards darkness. So he doesn't like the Jesuits either. But he agrees with Adams that we must let them in. Jefferson says, we shall have our follies without doubt, but our follies will be follies of enthusiasm, not of bigotry, not of, somewhat ironically, Jesuitism. Bigotry is the disease of ignorance, of morbid minds. Enthusiasm comes from the fee and the buoyant. Education and free discussions are the antidotes to both. We are destined to be a barrier against the returns of ignorance and barbarism. What a colossus we shall be. What a stand we shall make. And we shall be a ralliance for the reason and freedom of the globe. I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past. So good night. I will dream on, always fancying that Mrs. Adams and yourself are by my side, marking the progress and the obliquities of the ages and countries. And so what I want to come back to in both of these stories is that promise of the American system, of American values. That, as Adams notes, we have these ideals. And Jefferson says the same thing. We're going to have our moments where we fail. But we need to continue to strive for the best of who we are. Even if we're afraid, we need to strive for our ideals, move towards the good. And I think both Adams and Jefferson, if they had lived to see this story, would pull out of it that Cheney is one of those moments of failure, but that the response of the people of Bangor, and even Bapt's resilience itself, is a moment to recognize what America can be when we're at our best. And so what I'd like to do there then is maybe stop and open it up and see if you have any questions or anything I can talk about. I'll stop the recording, that way you're not intimidated by the